So we come to this summary slide. And this now shows you the trend in terms of democratic change in the world. I'm looking here only at countries over 1 million population as well, just for simplicity. But in my two articles written at different periods, you'll see slides that are a little bit different because they show it for all the countries in the world. Small countries, particularly small island states, you can probably figure out why, are more likely to be democracies and more likely to be liberal democracies than countries over 1 million population. So if you focus on just the somewhat bigger countries, the numbers are a little bit lower, but the trends are the same. And what you see here, looking first at the red line, which is the percentage of states in the world over 1 million population that meet at least the test of electoral democracy, what you see is that the percentage increased very gradually during the early years of the third wave, from say 24 to 30% in the mid-1980s. And then it expanded more in Latin America and in East Asia, and rose to about a third of all states in the world, a much higher proportion than had ever existed before. But then you see the Big Bang in 1989, and that is when, as a result of the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, and then the spread of the third wave to this vast frontier in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's now 49 independent states in sub-Saharan Africa. By then it was, I think, 48. So lots of opportunities to create new democracies. You see this extraordinary jump. For the first time in the history of the world, the majority of states in the world are electoral democracies. It's a stunning transformation. And it's a transformation that has lasted until this day. Now, if you go to this blue line here, this is the percentage of states in the world that meet the test of liberal democracy. I now have to explain where I got these numbers, okay? The percentage of states that are electoral democracies simply is the answer to the question, which states can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, by the definition I offered to you the other day. Freedom House began in the 1990s to identify which countries met that test, and I've basically used their designations, but I think sometimes their designations are a little too generous, so I've had to occasionally, in my classifications, pull some countries out because I didn't think they really met the test. For example, Tanzania for some years recently, and Freedom House was generally a bit late to recognize the deterioration of democracy in Russia, in Venezuela, in Turkey, in countries like that. I want to be a little more rigorous in saying they may have multiple political parties, they may have regular elections, they might have lots of NGOs, but if there aren't free and fair elections to determine who rules, it's not an electoral democracy. That's why the competitive authoritarianism article is so important. Now, to identify which countries are liberal democracies, I simply accept the data of Freedom House in this respect. Every year, so we're about to get it, I'm waiting with bated breath, I think we're about 1 week away from it. Every year, Freedom House issues its annual report on freedom in the world. And they rate every country in the world on two parallel scales of political rights and civil liberties. And these have a kind of backstory and a front story. The backstory, and we'll make the methodology site available to you so you can actually look at all their indicators and see how they develop their scores. The backstory is a checklist that sums up to a score of 40 on political rights and 60 on civil liberties, so you could get a 100-point score. The front story, which is the numbers that they tell the public, are summary scores that aggregate those two scales. And those range from 1, which is most free, to 7, which is most authoritarian, on civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to an independent judiciary, freedom from torture. 1 to 7, 7's most repressive. And then 1 to 7 on political rights, to form political parties, to vote by secret ballot, to be able to hold the government accountable with an independent legislature, things like that. So we've got two scales ranging from 1 to 7. I count as liberal any country that gets a 1 or a 2, one of the two best scores on each of the two scales, political rights and civil liberties. And that means India has almost never met the test of liberal democracy. Mexico has gone in and out of the category. Brazil still does by the judgment of Freedom House, at least as of last year, but I think you could raise a lot of questions about it. But almost all of Central and Eastern Europe, until recently Hungary, still meets the test, and the US and so on. Now, there are many other scales. The Economist magazine has just released its annual democracy index, and so there are many ways to do this. But you can see now the trend. Liberal democracy improved much more gradually than electoral democracy, and it didn't really start dramatically improving until the post-Cold War period, after 1989-90. What you see here, what I hope you see here, is a growing gap between liberal democracy and electoral democracy. This is all the democracies in the world. This is the subset that are liberal democracies. I'm about to start talking about the democratic transition, the democratic recession, and this is where it's been happening. Among the democracies of the world that have not been liberal. So I'm going to tell you, there is no liberal democracy in the world, not a single one of these, that suddenly just dies and has a heart attack, okay? First of all, any country that enters this category is highly likely to remain at least a democracy. And second of all, if they suffer an eventual failure of democracy, it's as a result of a long, steady process of degradation of the liberal character of democracy. This is a central point I made in my book starting with developing democracy in the late 1990s, which I think has become much clearer in the last 20 years. Now, I'll just say you can come to whatever normative conclusions you want, just as long as you kind of understand the both empirical and analytic dynamics here. But I'll say there's two reasons to care about liberal democracy. Number one, I would argue from a normative standpoint, it shouldn't just be elections and popular sovereignty that we care about. Rule of law is important. Human rights are important. Social justice and social inclusion and fairness and some degree of equality are other important values beyond just pure popular sovereignty. But I'd also say if it's popular sovereignty that you care about more than anything else, you're a lot likelier to preserve the real form of it if you have a liberal democracy than if you just have an illiberal electoral democracy. That's a really good and perceptive question, and I don't know the answer to it. There were obviously a few countries that exited the category. And you know, the problem with this data, there was no one big trend that, that really, I think, explains this. But I'm going to speculate. Actually, I think I do know the answer. What happened here in 1989 is that there was a kind of euphoria with the end of communism and the emergence of some new post-communist regimes. And particularly once you get to 1991, you know, and you get down here, some of these reveal themselves to be less liberal than it looked like they were going to be initially. I think it's possible Freedom House was a little over-exuberant in its ratings in the midst of some of these transitions, and then kind of reality caught up. Yeah? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, my guess would be it used to be one country, and then it split, so that's why the numbers can be different. So you had one not liberal USSR, and then you come to...
Oh, yeah, of course.
Having a lot of other countries
Yeah.
that not ended up being
Yeah.
democracies.
Yeah, that's possible too. Probably likely, yeah. It's a very timely question because we have today, you know, Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is proudly presenting illiberal democracy as a culturally appropriate and operationally superior model. I don't see any signs in Indian rhetoric or history of lack of aspiration to the package of liberal democracy. There was no kind of intellectual project in that regard. And you know, if you see the BJP party as possibly having some cultural arguments that could be interpreted that way, they didn't come to power until much, much later in India. So I think it's more just, you know, it takes a strong judiciary and pretty robust institutions to get to the deeper operational reality of liberal democracy with strong protection for human rights and the rule of law and really significant constraints on corruption. And it's hard for, it's not easy for lower income countries with weak states to get there. Yeah.
So, does the Arab Spring count as part of the third wave?
Yeah, I'm coming to that very soon. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about the sort of like the drop-off in electoral democracies at the end.
Yeah, I'm coming to that too. That's the democratic recession. Let's go there. Okay, so that's my next story, that you see here an inflection point, both for liberal democracy and for electoral democracy. The pace of democratic change in each slide kind of levels off, though you see an improvement, particularly with liberal democracy, between, say, the mid-90s up through 2006. And then democratic progress in the world just grinds to a halt in 2006. And then this is the last 12 years of democratic recession in the world, which I'm going to show you. A slight ebbing of liberal democracy, a perceptible decline in electoral democracy, but other trends that I think are deeper and more concerning than just what the aggregate data says. This is the distribution of regimes at the beginning of January 2018, so I don't have the new data yet. I will soon, but you know, you can see regionally, all of Western Europe in the Anglophone world, they were liberal democracies. Many of the Pacific Island states, about half of Latin America, most of Latin America and the Caribbean was at least democratic. And you know, you can see the drop-off by region. The Arab Spring was the kind of last big burst of quest for democratic change during this third wave of global democratization, or at least the most recent one. And we saw many countries, at least half a dozen, staging mass protests and demonstrations for democratic change, most famously in Egypt, where the dictator Mubarak was overthrown. But in only one of these instances did democracy actually result. That, of course, is Tunisia. And I just want you to kind of plant a seed in your mind that we'll come back to in the literature on democratic transitions. This, too, was not inevitable. Tunisia had the most favorable social and economic conditions for democracy. It was the closest to Europe, so you get the international dimension we'll talk about. It was the most westernized. You get a cultural dimension there. It had the highest levels of education, although not of per capita income. That, of course, is in the Gulf oil states. But for non-oil states, it was the most developed. But it also had a reasonably strong civil society. And these are four leaders of it who won the Nobel Peace Prize for their mediation efforts. So again, transitions are very uncertain dynamics. And this was a heavily negotiated transition where the critical mediation role played by these individuals, who were called the Quartet, who won the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, were very instrumental in bringing about democratic change. So we'll come back to this.